3 tales of terror, 3 nights bathed in blood. In the frozen wasteland of Alaska, an isolated military outpost is swallowed by a blizzard, and something far worse hunts in the storm. At a remote summer camp, counselors prepare for another season. But this year the full moon will rise, and the woods will come alive with something monstrous. Deep in the haunted forests of Eastern Europe, a group of desperate men flee justice, only to discover a fate far worse waiting in the trees. 3 stories, 3 cursed nights, and no one will escape the hunger of the beast.
The wind howled through the desolate Alaskan wilderness, its icy fingers scraping the sides of the military outpost. Outside, a blanket of snow stretched endlessly, thick and unmoving, as if the earth itself had been frozen in time. The night sky above was a cold black, punctuated by the occasional flicker of distant stars. The moon hung low, casting long shadows over the jagged mountain peaks. Inside the outpost, a dozen men huddled in uneasy silence, their breath rising in thick clouds in the dim light of the lanterns. The thick timber walls creaked and groaned with the relentless force of the storm. Captain Elias Mercer stared at the fire crackling in the hearth, his eyes unblinking, his posture rigid. Beside him sat Sergeant Henry Graves, the man's brow furrowed in concentration as he sharpened his knife. Around them, the other men moved like shadows, lost in their own thoughts. The storm outside had become more than a nuisance. It was a prison. The weather had sealed them in, and their supplies were dwindling. The howling wind seemed to grow louder, pressing against the walls of the fort as if something was waiting just outside. Something they couldn't see, something they couldn't hear. "Storm's getting worse," said Private Will Connors, the youngest of the men. His voice trembled, though he did his best to hide it. "How much longer until we're out of here?" "Not long," Mercer replied, his voice low, his eyes narrowing. "We'll make it through. Just keep your wits about you." The storm raged outside, and as the hours dragged on, an unnatural stillness descended over the outpost. Then came the sound, the faintest of sounds, distant and eerie. A growl, the kind that never seemed to fade, like a warning carried on the wind. The day had begun like any other, the men breaking their fast in quiet routines. There was no talk of the strange sounds that had echoed across the camp last night. No mention of the unease that had settled over the men like a thick fog. Yet when the scouts had gone out that morning, something had changed. 3 soldiers, including a veteran fur trader named Samuel Pike, had ventured out to gather supplies. When they didn't return by dusk, Mercer had sent out another squad to search for them. The men found the snow trampled and the footprints in the deep drifts, heavy, deliberate. But they found no sign of the missing men, only the scent of death, a coppery tang in the bitter air. By the time the squad returned, it was too late. The first body had been found, or what was left of it. The men had been too afraid to go further, but Mercer had to know. He led the remaining soldiers into the woods, their lanterns bobbing as they made their way into the dark expanse of the forest. The blood was fresh, soaking into the snow, staining it a deep red. A trail of shredded clothing and mangled flesh led them to a small clearing, and there they found Pike. His body had been torn apart, his limbs had been snapped, twisted as though they'd been bent by some terrible force. His torso had been shredded by claws that could not belong to any creature of this earth. The fur trader's stories of wolves and bears seemed laughable now. This was something far worse. "God help us," muttered Sergeant Graves, his voice a rasp. He recoiled at the sight, but Mercer stood frozen, his jaw clenched tight. He turned to the others, his expression grim. "We need to get back to the outpost now." The night was unbearable. The wind screamed outside, rattling the shutters and causing the lanterns inside the fort to flicker. The men gathered around the hearth, their faces drawn with exhaustion. No one spoke. The body of Pike had been brought back, wrapped in a blanket, but the sight of it had only unsettled them further. No one could ignore the awful truth anymore. The creature that had killed Pike wasn't an ordinary predator. Whatever it was more than a wolf, more than a bear. It was something that hunted like a man, something that had a mind of its own. As Mercer sat in his chair, staring into the fire, his thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash from outside. The men jumped to their feet, weapons drawn, the sound of boots pounding against the floor. Mercer's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the hilt of his rifle. "Stay inside. Keep the doors locked," Mercer ordered. "I'll go check." The storm raged as Mercer stepped out into the cold, his breath forming a cloud in front of him. His boots crunched against the snow as he moved, each step a painful reminder of the freezing cold. The night was suffocating, the wind biting at his skin. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. A faint sound like the snapping of twigs, the scrape of claws on the ice. Mercer's pulse quickened. He wasn't alone. Something was out there. As he moved forward, the creature emerged from the shadows. It was massive, towering over him, its eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. Its fur was matted, its mouth dripping with the blood of its victims. The beast lunged at him with terrifying speed, but Mercer was ready. He fired a shot, the blast echoing across the landscape. The werewolf screamed, a horrible inhuman sound, and staggered back. But it was only momentary. The creature howled, its voice carrying through the wind, a sound that chilled Mercer to his core. And then it was gone, vanishing into the night as quickly as it had appeared. Mercer staggered back to the fort, his mind racing. The hunt had begun. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the fort the tension was suffocating. The men were on edge, and Mercer could feel the eyes of the soldiers on him as they gathered their weapons. Everyone knew what they were up against now. The creature wasn't a wolf, and it wasn't a man. It was something in between, something that should never have existed. The men fortified the doors, windows, and any other potential weak spots. The fire was kept burning, its light dancing across the walls as Mercer addressed the group. "We fight together," he said, his voice strong despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We hold this outpost until the storm clears. We don't let it in." But the storm didn't clear. The night stretched on, and the howls of the werewolf grew louder. One by one, the men disappeared, drawn out into the snow to meet their fate. Mercer fought valiantly, but the creature was relentless. It seemed to know exactly where to strike, how to twist its attack. And when Mercer finally confronted it face to face, it was no longer just a beast. It spoke, its voice low and guttural, as if the man who had once been part of the outpost was still trapped inside. It had been one of them, the soldier who had gone missing weeks ago. But now he was a monster, and he was here to end them all. The fire had burned low and the storm had finally begun to die down. Mercer, bloodied and broken, stood alone in the outpost. The creature lay still on the ground before him, its eyes darkened. Mercer had done it. He had killed it. But as he staggered toward the door, his own body trembling, He felt the unmistakable sting of a bite on his arm. The moon was full again, the night was quiet, the storm had passed. But as Mercer's vision blurred, he knew the truth. The curse was far from over.
The forest was alive in the dead of night, but not with the chirping of crickets or the rustling of leaves in the summer breeze. It was alive with something else, something primal, something waiting. A thick fog clung to the trees, swirling in the moonlight. Beyond the towering pines, a figure crouched near the lake's edge, its breath visible in the cool air. The figure was shaking, not from fear, but from something far worse. Pain. Deep, writhing pain, as if the very bones beneath the skin were shifting, breaking, reshaping. The man gasped, clutching his stomach as sweat poured down his face. His nails dug into the soft dirt, his fingers elongating, twisting into something inhuman. He tried to stifle his scream, but it was no use. The transformation had begun, and by the time the sun rose, there would be nothing human left. The yellow school bus rumbled up the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust as it approached Camp Hollow Creek. Inside, the group of summer camp counselors laughed, shoved each other playfully, and chattered about the summer ahead. Jenna had never been to Hollow Creek before, but something about it felt wrong. The lake was vast, almost too still, its surface reflecting the afternoon sun like a sheet of glass. The thick woods beyond seemed to swallow the camp, pressing in from all sides. The camp itself was old but well-maintained. Cabins nestled between the trees, a large mess hall, a boathouse near the docks. Everything looked normal, but normal can be deceiving. As the bus doors creaked open, the counselors piled out, stretching and breathing in the warm summer air. We survived the ride. Chris, the broad-shouldered jock, grinned as he threw his duffel bag over his shoulder. Now all we gotta do is survive each other. Funny, Mia, the camp's resident punk rocker, smirked. You're gonna wish you stayed on that bus once you realize there's no TV or air conditioning out here. Kyle, the movie-obsessed horror nerd, adjusted his thick glasses. It's a classic setup, guys. Isolated summer camp, young people partying in the woods, and some psycho lurking around with a machete. Randy, the prankster, cut in, grinning. Dude, get over it. This isn't a horror movie. But Jenna wasn't so sure. They were the only ones here. The campers wouldn't arrive for another week, and the camp owner hadn't shown up to greet them. The cabins sat empty. The forest beyond the lake was too quiet. And when Old Man Peterson showed up, things got even worse. The sun had started to set, painting the lake with streaks of orange and red when Old Man Peterson arrived. No one had heard him approach. 1 second, the counselors were alone. The next, he was there. The old man looked like he had been part of the woods themselves. A wiry figure wrapped in a long, tattered coat, his face weathered and hollow, his gray hair matted. But it was his eyes that unnerved Jenna most. They were wild, fearful. You shouldn't be here, he rasped. Not tonight. Chris rolled his eyes. Great. The local town, crazy. Peterson ignored him, his gaze locked onto Jenna, then to the others. You need to leave. Before the moon rises. Randy chuckled. Oh, let me guess. There's a curse on the camp, right? The old man's face darkened. Something's in these woods, Peterson whispered. Something that feeds under the full moon. Kyle perked up, intrigued. You mean a werewolf? The others laughed, but Peterson didn't. There's something out there, he said, voice low. It killed them years ago, the counselors before you, the ones that came before that. Hollow Creek ain't been safe since. Jenna felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. "Then why hasn't anyone shut the place down?" she asked. Peterson shook his head, because it always lets one live. One survivor, one left to tell the story. And every time they open the camp again, and the cycle starts over. Chris scoffed. "Okay, crazy old man. Thanks for the bedtime story." Peterson's expression grew grim. "You don't believe me? Then stay." He turned toward the woods. "But when you hear the howling, don't run. It'll only make things worse." And with that, he vanished into the trees. The night came quickly, and so did the screams. Jenna had just been settling into her cabin when she heard it, a blood-curdling shriek somewhere near the boathouse. She and Chris rushed into the darkness, flashlights cutting through the trees, their breath heavy in the humid air. Then they found him, or what was left of him. Randy's body was in pieces, his blood splattered across the wooden dock. His throat had been torn out, deep claw marks running down his chest. The air reeked of copper and death. Chris gagged. "What the hell?" Then, a low growl from the trees. Jenna's heart stopped. The thing that stepped into the light was massive, towering over them, covered in thick matted fur. Its glowing yellow eyes locked onto hers. Its lips curled back, revealing jagged, wet teeth. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was both. And then, it charged. Chris shoved Jenna out of the way as the werewolf lunged, its claws raking through the air where she had stood just seconds earlier. The force of its movement sent Chris stumbling back onto the blood-soaked dock. Jenna scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in short gasps as she tried to process what she was seeing. The creature was monstrous, its elongated limbs and hunched frame moving in an unnatural, predatory way. Its eyes glowing yellow, locked onto Chris as it curled its lips back, revealing jagged, dripping teeth. Chris didn't even have time to scream before it slammed him into the ground. A sickening crunch echoed through the night as its jaws clamped down on his shoulder, tearing through muscle and bone like wet paper. Chris let out a guttural, agonized scream, his fingers digging into the wood of the dock, his legs kicking as blood spurted from the wound. The werewolf's snout was buried in his flesh, its claws tightening around his rib cage. Jenna grabbed the nearest object she could find, an oar from the boathouse. She swung it with all her strength, the wood cracking against the beast's head. It barely flinched. Instead, the werewolf snarled and turned its head toward her. Chris's ragged breath was weakening beneath it. The monster had him pinned. Jenna raised the oar again, gripping it tighter with trembling hands. She swung it downward, this time jamming the blunt end straight into its eye. The werewolf let out an ear-piercing roar, releasing Chris's mangled body as it stumbled back, claws swiping blindly. Jenna grabbed Chris's arm, trying to drag him away, but his body was barely moving. His face was pale, slick with sweat and blood. "Jenna." His voice was a weak, gurgling rasp. "We have to go," she hissed, tears welling in her eyes. Chris's hand shot out, gripping her wrist, but not in desperation, in pain. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she watched his veins blacken, his eyes flickering with something unnatural. The bite. Chris was turning. She yanked her hand away, a lump forming in her throat. The werewolf had recovered. It lifted its head to the sky and let out a bone-chilling howl. From the woods, a second howl answered, and a third. Jenna felt a chill run down her spine as the realization sank in. There wasn't just one. There was a pack. The trees came alive as dark shapes moved through the undergrowth. More of them, their glowing eyes flashing through the fog. Chris's body spasmed violently, his back arching, his mouth twisted open in an unnatural snarl, his nails blackened, lengthened, his teeth sharpened. Jenna stumbled backward as her best friend became one of them. She had no choice. She ran. Jenna sprinted through the woods, branches slicing at her face as she tried to ignore the thunderous footsteps behind her. The werewolves were hunting her now. She could hear their ragged breaths, their low growls. The mess hall was just ahead. She burst through the doors, shoving them closed just as a massive weight slammed against them. Her eyes darted across the room. The gasoline. Her hands fumbled as she grabbed the canisters, sloshing fuel across the wooden floors. The doors began to splinter. Jenna lit a match. The doors exploded inward as the werewolves barreled inside, their claws glinting in the firelight. She dropped the match. Flames erupted. The beasts shrieked, their bodies igniting, but they kept coming. Jenna fought them off, swinging a broken chair leg like a bat, ducking and weaving as they snapped at her. The fire spread. A werewolf snarled and lunged. Jenna dove for the window. Glass shattered as she hit the ground outside, rolling to her feet, ignoring the burns and cuts. She ran. The mess hall was an inferno behind her. The screams of the burning werewolves echoed through the trees. The sun was rising. Jenna collapsed near the lake, her body trembling. It was over, or so she thought. Jenna awoke in the hospital. The doctors told her she had been found wandering near the highway, delirious. The police had found nothing at Camp Hollow Creek. No bodies, no blood, no werewolves, just ashes. Jenna sat up, staring at her bandaged arm. The bite mark. A chill settled deep in her bones. She knew the truth. The cycle wasn't over. She had survived, but the curse lived on. And when the next full moon rose, she wouldn't be Jenna anymore. She would be the hunter, and the cycle would begin again. The first man was hanged at dusk. His face was covered in grime, his clothes torn and damp with sweat, his boots coated in dried mud from the long trek through the valley. He had been a thief, or so the villagers claimed, a highwayman who had robbed and murdered travelers along the road to Ehrlich's Hollow, the dense, ancient forest that stretched for miles beyond the village of Borsk. Now, he swayed in the cold autumn air, his feet twitching as the last shreds of life slipped away. The villagers stood in silence as they watched. There were no cheers, no shouts of approval, just the grim acknowledgement that justice had been served. Another man stood next to him, wrists bound, his breath ragged. He knew he would be next. The village elder, a man named Father Gregor, stepped forward, his white beard barely stirring in the wind. "You do not deserve the mercy of steel," Gregor said. His voice was calm but heavy, as though burdened by something deeper than the execution itself. "But we are not executioners." He gestured toward the woods. "You have one chance. Take the path into the hollow. If you survive the night, you may leave." The condemned man's lips trembled. "No," he whispered. The villagers did not react. They only watched as two men untied his wrists, shoved him toward the tree line, and stepped back. "The beast takes its payment," Father Gregor said. The man hesitated, then he ran. He plunged into the forest of no return, his cries swallowed by the darkness beyond the trees. And in the distance, something howled. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the trees. Anton crouched near the flames, warming his hands. His coat was tattered, his boots soaked from the rain that had fallen earlier that evening. He listened to the others murmur in hushed voices as they passed around a bottle of stolen whiskey. "3 dead," Luca muttered, shaking his head. His face was partially illuminated by the fire, his sharp features drawn with exhaustion. 3 hanged like dogs, the others, no one knows. Anton lifted his gaze. And the loot? Marek, the youngest of the group, glanced at him. Gone. The villagers must have taken it. Anton cursed under his breath. It had been a perfect job, an ambush on a nobleman's caravan, a quick and clean escape into the hills. But then one mistake had turned it into a bloodbath. The guards had fought harder than expected, and 2 of their men had fallen before they had even reached the horses. Now they were on the run. Anton's fingers curled around the hilt of his dagger. We need to disappear, for good. Luca nodded toward the tree line. The only place to hide is through there. Anton followed his gaze. The forest loomed ahead, an expanse of gnarled trees and creeping fog. The locals called it Ehrlich's Hollow, but among thieves and outlaws it was known as something else. The Forest of No Return. "You're mad," Marek whispered. "No one comes back from those woods." Luca smirked. "No one comes back from the gallows either." Anton stared into the darkness beyond the trees. He had heard the stories, of course. Stories of men who entered and were never seen again. Of screams carried on the wind. Of clawed prints in the dirt that led nowhere. But he was a practical man, and more importantly, he was a desperate one. "We go in," he said finally. The others hesitated, but in the end, they followed. The moment they stepped beneath the trees, the world changed. The firelight vanished. The warmth of the night air disappeared, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling cold. The branches overhead twisted like skeletal fingers, blocking out the sky. The only sound was the crunch of dead leaves beneath their boots. "Stay close," Anton whispered. They moved in a tight line, their eyes darting between the trees. The deeper they walked, the heavier the air became, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Luca muttered a curse. "This place is cursed." Anton ignored him. "We keep moving." Then they heard it. A branch snapping. Marek whipped around. What was that? No one answered. Another sound. A low growl, barely audible. Anton's grip tightened on his dagger. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Then Luca spoke. "There's someone in the trees." Anton turned and saw her. She stood just beyond the firelight, her figure barely visible between the twisted trees. She was beautiful, but wrong. Her pale skin seemed to glow, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She wore no cloak, no shoes, and yet she did not shiver in the cold. "Who are you?" Anton demanded. She smiled. "I am lost," she said softly. Her voice sent a chill through his bones. Marek took a step forward. "We should help her." "Like hell we should," Luca hissed. "She doesn't belong here." Anton hesitated. The hunger in her eyes unsettled him, but leaving a lone woman in the woods felt wrong. "Where did you come from?" he asked. Her smile widened. "Here." A howl echoed through the trees. Anton felt his blood turn to ice. The woman's eyes gleamed, and then in the moonlight, her teeth sharpened. Luca moved first, drawing his sword. "Get away from her," the woman laughed. And then she changed, her limbs elongated, her spine twisting with a sickening crack. Fur erupted from her skin, her mouth stretching into a snout filled with jagged teeth. Marek screamed. The werewolf lunged. Anton barely had time to move before Luca was lifted off the ground, the beast's claws tearing through his chest. His screams became gurgles as blood poured from his throat. The others ran. Branches tore at their clothes. Their lungs burned, but they did not stop, because behind them, in the darkness, more howls joined the first, and the hunt had only just begun. The forest seemed alive now, breathing around them, shifting in the darkness. The trees groaned, branches shivering though there was no wind. Anton's lungs burned as he ran, his boots crunching over brittle twigs and damp earth. The howls behind him were growing closer. Luca was dead. He had barely let out a scream before the beast had torn into his chest, blood spraying the underbrush. The woman, no, the thing, had changed. One moment she'd been standing there, naked and pale beneath the moonlight, and the next, her bones had snapped, fur had erupted from her flesh, and she had become something monstrous. Anton had seen men die before, but nothing like that. Marek was beside him, panting, barely keeping up. The boy had always been light on his feet, but fear had taken him now, his eyes wide, his breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "They're chasing us," Marek choked out. "I know," Anton snapped. Behind them, something tore through the trees, its heavy footfalls pounding the dirt. Anton didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the thing gaining ground, feel its breath on the back of his neck. They burst into a clearing, nearly slipping on the damp leaves. The moon, full and swollen, shone overhead, casting pale light over the open space. Anton's heart pounded. An open space meant no cover. "We keep running," Anton said. "No stopping." Marek didn't answer, just kept moving. But the boy was slowing, his exhaustion catching up to him. Anton grabbed his arm, yanking him forward. "Not now. We don't stop now." But it was too late. A low growl rumbled from the tree line. Anton and Marek froze. The beast stepped out of the shadows. It was her, the woman who had lured them in, but now she was something else. 7 feet tall, hunched and rippling with muscle, her black fur matted with Luca's blood. Her snout dripped with saliva, her yellow eyes gleaming. And then she wasn't alone. 2 more figures emerged from the trees. More of them, their bodies twisted and grotesque, their claws curling against the dirt. Marek whimpered, "God save us." Anton drew his knife. It was useless, he knew that, but his hands weren't ready to accept death just yet. The lead werewolf sniffed the air and let out a low, guttural chuckle. Then it charged. Anton dove aside as the beast lunged, its claws swiping through the empty air where he had been standing. Marek wasn't as lucky. The boy let out a short, sharp cry as the werewolf's massive hand clamped around his throat. It lifted him effortlessly, his legs kicking, his fingers clawing at the beast's wrist. Anton saw the horror in Marek's eyes. It wasn't just pain, it was realization. Realization that he was going to die. The werewolf's jaws unhinged and clamped down on Marek's shoulder. The sound of crunching bone filled the clearing. Marek let out a blood-curdling scream. Anton moved before he could think. Instinct, rage, fear. He rushed forward, slashing his knife across the beast's arm. The blade barely cut through its thick fur, but the werewolf flinched. It turned to Anton. Marek's body slumped to the ground, twitching. Blood pulsed from the open wound at his neck, soaking the earth beneath him. Anton's stomach churned. Marek was still alive, barely. The lead werewolf stepped toward Anton, sniffing. "Run," Marek croaked. His voice was barely a whisper. Anton clenched his fists. He wanted to fight. He wanted to drag Marek to safety, but he knew the truth. There was no saving him, so Anton did the only thing he could. He ran. The trees whipped past in a blur as Anton sprinted deeper into the woods. The howls behind him were louder now, closer. The pack was playing with him. They could have killed him already, but they wanted the chase. Anton's breath came in ragged gulps, his limbs burning. The path twisted, dark shapes looming around him. He could barely see in the darkness, but he didn't stop. Then, his boot caught on something. Anton hit the ground hard, his head slamming into the dirt. The world spun, pain exploding through his skull. He groaned, trying to push himself up. A shadow fell over him. Anton rolled just in time to avoid the werewolf's strike. Its claws tore into the ground, ripping up soil where his head had been seconds earlier. Anton scrambled backward. The werewolf grinned, a sick human expression on something that was no longer human. Anton's pulse pounded in his ears. He was going to die. The beast's lips curled. It crouched lower, preparing for the final lunge. Anton reached for his knife. He could try. He could. The werewolf froze. A low whistle echoed through the trees. Anton blinked. The beast growled, then stepped back, turning its head toward the sound. Another whistle, and then a voice. "You're taking too long," the voice said, calm and cold. Anton's blood turned to ice. From the trees, a figure stepped forward, and in the pale light, Anton saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was Father Gregor, the village elder, the man who had sent others to die in this forest. He was standing among the werewolves, and he was smiling. "Ah," Gregor said, glancing down at Anton. "Another one." Anton stared, his mind struggling to make sense of it. "You," his voice shook. "You knew. You sent people here to die." Gregor chuckled. "To die?" He shook his head. No, not to die." His eyes flickered yellow in the moonlight. Anton's stomach dropped. Not to die. To change. Anton felt something sharp press against his throat. He looked up. One of the werewolves had its claws resting against his skin. Gregor knelt beside him, his smile never fading. "You've proven yourself, Anton," he murmured. "You ran faster than the others. You fought back." Anton struggled, but the werewolf held him down. I don't want..." Gregor leaned closer. "It's not a choice." Anton's breath hitched as Gregor opened his mouth, and his teeth were sharp. Anton screamed as Gregor bit deep into his shoulder. The pain was unbearable. Anton convulsed, his body burning, his bones twisting. The werewolves stood in a circle around him, watching as he changed. His nails blackened, his jaw stretched, his vision flooded with red. His last human thought was a whisper in the back of his mind. I should never have entered the forest. Then, the last of his humanity was gone, and Anton howled at the moon.